Self-immolation refers to killing oneself as a sacrifice. While usage since the 1960s has typically referred only to setting oneself on fire, the term historically refers to a much wider range of suicidal options, such as leaping off a cliff, starvation, or seppuku. Self-immolation is often used as a form of protest or for the purposes of martyrdom. It has centuries-long traditions in some cultures, while in modern times it has become a type of radical political protest. Michael Biggs compiled a list of 533 self-immolations reported by Western media from the 1960s to 2002. This list uses the more general definition of self-immolation, including any intentional suicide on behalf of a collective cause. Etymology: the English word immolation originally meant killing a sacrificial victim. Sacrifice, and came to figuratively mean destruction, especially by fire. Its etymology was from Latin immolare, to sprinkle with sacrificial meal. To sacrifice in ancient Roman religion. Self-immolation, setting oneself on fire, especially as a form of protest, was first recorded in Lady Morgan's France. It was Western media coverage of Buddhist monk Thich Quang Duc immolating himself in protest of the Buddhist crisis by the Vietnamese Ngo Dinh Diem regime in 1963 that introduced the word self-immolation to a wide English-speaking audience and gave it a strong association with fire. The alternative name Bonzo comes from the same era, because the Buddhist monks who immolated themselves were often referred to by the term bonze in English literature before the mid-20th century, particularly when describing monks from East Asia and French Indochina. This term is derived from the Japanese word bonzo for a priest or monk, and has become less common in modern literature. History: self-immolation is tolerated by some elements of Mahayana Buddhism and Hinduism, and it has been practiced for many centuries, especially in India, for various reasons, including sati, political protest, devotion, and renouncement. Certain warrior cultures, such as in the Charans and Rajats, also practiced self-immolation. The act of sacrificing one's own body, though not by fire, is a component of two well-known stories found in the ancient Buddhist text known as the Jataka tales, which, according to Buddhist tradition, gives accounts of past incarnations of the Buddha. In the Hungry Tigress Jataka, Prince Sattva looked down from a cliff and saw a starving tigress that was going to eat her newborn cubs, and compassionately sacrificed his body in order to feed the tigers and spare their lives. In the Sibai Jataka, King Shibi or Shibi was renowned for unselfishness, and the gods Shakra and Vishvakarman tested him by transforming into a hawk and a dove. The dove fell on the king's lap while trying to escape the hawk, and sought refuge. Rather than surrender the dove, Shibi offered his own flesh equivalent and weight to the dove, and the hawk agreed. They had rigged the balance scale, and King Shibi continued cutting off his flesh until half his body was gone, when the gods revealed themselves, restored his body, and blessed him. The Buddhist god of healing, the Medicine King, or Medicine Buddha, was associated with autocremation. The Lotus Sutra describes the Medicine King drinking scented oils, wrapping his body in an oil-soaked cloth, and burning himself as an offering to the Buddha. His body flamed for 1,200 years, he was reincarnated, burned off his forearms for 72,000 years, which enabled many to achieve enlightenment, and his arms were miraculously restored. Zormanashigas was a monk of the Sramana tradition who, according to ancient historians such as Strabo and Dio Cassius, met Nicholas of Damascus in Antioch around 13 AD and burnt himself to death in Athens shortly thereafter. Self-immolation has a long history in Chinese Buddhism. The relevant terms are, Angshan Chinese, a lose the body, or Chinese, A.E. forget the body, Ishan Chinese, E.E. abandon the body, and Sheshan Chinese, to give up the body. James A. Benn explains the semantic range of Chinese Buddhist self-immolation. But abandoning the body also covers a broad range of more extreme acts, feeding one's body to insects, slicing off one's flesh, burning one's fingers or arms, burning incense on the skin, starving, slicing, or drowning oneself, leaping from cliffs or trees, feeding one's body to wild animals, self-mummification, and of course, autocremation. The monk Faoyi cubed c¾ carried out the earliest recorded Chinese self-immolation. He first informed the illegitimate Prince Yao Zu, a section SHC, a Euro brother of Yao Chang who founded the non-Chinese Kiang state, later Qin, a Euro, that he intended to burn himself alive. Yao tried to dissuade Faoyi, but he publicly swallowed incense chips, wrapped his body in oiled cloth, and chanted while setting fire to himself. The religious and lay witnesses were described as being full of grief and admiration. Following Faoyi's example, many Buddhist monks and nuns have used self-immolation for political purposes. Based upon analysis of Chinese historical records from the 4th to the 20th centuries, Ben discovered, although some monks did offer their bodies in periods of relative prosperity and peace, we have seen a marked coincidence between acts of self-immolation and times of crisis, especially when secular powers were hostile towards Buddhism. For example, Daoxuan Zhu Gao Sun Tuan Coa of Florin cubed continued biographies of eminent monks records 5 monastics who self-immolated on the Tsungnan Mountains in response to the 574–577 persecution of Buddhism by Emperor Wu of northern Zhou. While self-immolation practices in China were based upon Indian Buddhist traditions, they acquired some distinctively Chinese aspects. An unburned tongue, which supposedly remained pink and moist owing to self-immolation while chanting the Lotus Sutra, was based on the belief in Shara Buddhist relics, purportedly from a master's remains after cremation. Burning off fingers was a kind of gradual self-immolation, often in commemoration of relics or textual recitations. The Tang dynasty monk Wuran Cy had a spiritual vision in which Manjusri told him to support the Buddhist community on Mount Wutai. After organizing meals for 1 million monks, Wuran burned off a finger in sacrifice, and eventually after 10 million meals, had burned off all his fingers. Zikanye became a favorite of Emperor Gaozu of later Jin for practicing finger burning to memorialize sutra recitations. Buddhist mummies refers to monks and nuns who practiced self-mummification through extreme self-mortification, for instance, Dokshuye 1/4. Spontaneous human combustion was a rare form of self-immolation that Buddhists associated with samadhi, consciously leaving one's body at the time of enlightenment. The monk Ning a megapascal 3/4 copyright stacked up firewood to burn himself, but, as soon the torch was raised, his body started to burn like a rotten root and was soon completely consumed. A wise person declared, "He has entered the fiery samadhi." James A. Ben concludes that, for many monks and lay people in Chinese history, self-immolation was a form of Buddhist practice that modeled and expressed a particular bodily or somatic path that led towards Buddhahood. Jan Yunhui explains the medieval Chinese Buddhist precedents for self-immolation. Relying exclusively on authoritative Chinese Buddhist texts and, through the use of these texts, interpreting such acts exclusively in terms of doctrines and beliefs rather than in terms of their socio-political and historical context, the article allows its readers to interpret these deaths as acts that refer only to a distinct set of beliefs that happen to be foreign to the non-Buddhist. Jimmy Yu has shown that self-immolation cannot be interpreted based on Buddhist doctrine and beliefs alone, but the practice must be understood in the larger context of the Chinese religious landscape. He examines many primary sources from the 16th and 17th century and demonstrates that bodily practices of self-inflicted violence, including self-immolation, was ritually performed not only by Buddhists but also by Taoists and literati officials who either exposed their naked body to the sun in a prolonged period of time as a form of self-sacrifice or burned themselves as a method of procuring rain. In other words, self-immolation was a sanctioned part of Chinese culture that was public, scripted, and intelligible both to the person doing the act and to those who viewed and interpreted it, regardless of their various religion affiliations. During the Great Schism of the Russian Church, entire villages of Old Believers burned themselves to death in an act known as fire baptism. Scattered instances of self-immolation have also been recorded by the Jesuit priests of France in the early 17th century. However, their practice of this was not intended to be fatal. They would burn certain parts of their bodies to symbolize the pain Jesus endured while upon the cross. A 1973 study by a prison doctor suggested that people who choose self-immolation as a form of suicide are more likely to be in a disturbed state of consciousness, such as epilepsy. In her article Can the Subaltern Speak? Philosopher Gayatri Spivak discusses how self-immolation is a way Hindu law regulated women in pre-colonial India. According to Spivak, the necessity to commit self-immolation imprisons women in a double-binding colonial and post-colonial India. In Spivak's post-colonial framework, the woman who commits self-immolation takes the form of a subaltern. Political protest. A number of Buddhist monks immolated themselves by burning in protest of the discriminatory treatment endured by Buddhists under the administration of President Nga Anh in South Vietnam. Even though violence against oneself is prohibited by most interpretations of Buddhist doctrine. The 23rd chapter of the Lotus Sutra recounts the life story of the Bodhisattva Medicine King, which served as the main inspiration for the monks and nuns who self-immolated. In the sutra, the Medicine King demonstrates his insight into the selfless nature of his body by ritualistically setting his body aflame, spreading the light of the Dharma for 1200 years. The Bodhisattva shone his light about him so that everyone could see as he could see, giving them the opportunity to see the deathless nature of the ultimate. The widespread coverage of the self-immolations of the Buddhist monks in Western media established the practice as a type of a political protest. Self-immolations are often public, dramatic, political, and thus newsworthy. They can be seen as a type of altruistic suicides for the collective cause. Unlike suicide attacks, self-immolations are not intended to inflict physical harm or material damage. They attract attention and become glorified as martyrdom, because of the perception of great pain, but they do not guarantee death for the burned. While the burning of vital tissue can be very painful during self-immolation, shock or asphyxiation quickly make the event painless, as do the onset of third-degree burns which destroy the nerve endings. Suicides by self-immolation have led to numerous copycat suicides. Researchers have counted almost 100 self-immolations covered by the New York Times and the Times between 1963 and 1971. Most of these suicides occurred in Asia and in the United States during protests opposing the Vietnam War. In 1968 the practice spread to the Soviet bloc with self-immolation of Polish accountant and Army Krajowa veteran Ryszard Sake, as well as that of Czech student Jan Bulch in protest against the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia. As a protest against a Soviet rule in Lithuania, 19-year-old Romas Kalanta set himself on fire in Kaunas. Non-political suicides by fire also became more prevalent. The practice continues with India leading as many as 1,451 and 1,584 self-immolations have been reported in 2000 and 2001, respectively. A particularly high wave of self-immolations in India has been recorded in 1990 protesting the reservation in India. Tamil Nadu has the highest number of self-immolations in India till date. It is considered to be the capital of self-immolation in India. Since 2009, at least 120 Tibetans have self-immolated, more than 40 have died. The Dalai Lama has said he does not encourage the protests, but he has praised the courage of those who engage in self-immolation. However, the Chinese government claims that he and the Tibetan exile government are inciting these acts. In 2013, the Dalai Lama questioned the effectiveness of this tactic. He has also stated that the Tibetans are acting of their own will and he is powerless to influence them to stop carrying out immolation suicides. A wave of self-immolation protests occurred in conjunction with the Arab Spring protests in the Middle East and North Africa, with at least 14 recorded incidents. These actions helped inspire the Arab Spring, including the 2010-2011 Tunisian Revolution, the main catalyst of which was the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi, the 2011 Algerian protests, and the 2011 Egyptian Revolution. There have also been self-immolation protests in Saudi Arabia, Mauritania, and Syria. During the United States federal government shutdown of 2013, a man poured gasoline over his body and set himself on fire on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. He died in the hospital shortly afterward. In June 2014, Reverend Charles Moore poured gasoline over his body and set himself on fire in a strip mall parking lot near Dallas to racism and discrimination. He died upon arrival at a hospital in Dallas. See also, 2013 Bulgarian self-immolations, Buddhist views on suicide, list of self-immolations in Telangana, self-immolations in Tunisia, self-immolation protests by Tibetans in China, references. External links, The Self-Immolators. A chronological list containing the biographies and last statements of all known self-immolators since Thich Quang Duc in 1967.